Good morning / good afternoon / across all time zones. I hope everyone's doing well. I'm gonna drop in the chat our icebreaker for today, and I'll probably drop it in the chat a couple times. But considering we do have a jam-packed agenda, I know we'll want to move forward in the next couple minutes. So feel free to introduce folks in the chat. We'd love to hear your name, location, organization, and your favorite water activity, whether it's in the pool or the beach, especially with summer right around the corner.
Yes, and I just wanted to also welcome everyone. I'm Irene. I'm the Climate Justice Director at Green Latinos, and thanks for joining this month's Colectivo Encuentro. And yeah, we're excited to get this going. I think people are still kind of rolling in, but definitely answer, feel free to answer the icebreaker question and drop some information into the chat so we can get to know each other a little bit.
Cumbia, can you move it to the next slide so the icebreaker's on the screen, please? Awesome. Yes.
Love swimming and floating around. That's a great one. Floating in the water is the best. Rafting in the river, that's very adventurous. That actually kind of scares me a little bit. It sounds fun but scary. Stand-up paddle boarding. Swimming in a mountain river. That's nice.
Irene, if it's all right with you, would you be down to get started and I can
Yeah, let's get going. Thank y'all. This is I appreciate everyone kind of putting in your favorite water summer activity. Yeah, let's get going.
Beautiful. Hello, everyone. I hope everyone's having a great day so far, wherever y'all are at. My name is Dharma Santos Santiago. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the climate justice and clean air advocate here at Green Latinos, based in Brooklyn, and I'm a huge lay by the pool, beach, and get a nice tan moment. So definitely as folks are coming in, drop your name, location, organization, and favorite water activity into the chat. We have a jam-packed agenda, so I'm gonna go ahead and keep it moving forward to our next slide, please. So again, welcome everyone to our Climate Justice and Clean Air Encuentro for the month of May. We hold these quarterly, and if folks are not muted, I would please ask that y'all be muted, just so that we don't have any outside noise. But really quickly, just gonna run through the agenda. We're here taking a couple minutes to open up the space. We have an icebreaker. I also want to give a Zoom recording warning that we are recording this session. We will be posting it on a private YouTube link and sending it out to all the registrants in the coming days for folks to have this content and knowledge and dialogue on hand to review whether they were here or couldn't make it. And in today's conversation, we'll start off with Stephen Schima talking about permitting reform, the ongoing fights with the debt ceiling negotiations, what that means for the security of NEPA, and how environmental justice advocacy can shape where we're going in this fight and what we can do. We'll be passing it on to Cinthia Moore from the Nevada Environmental Justice Coalition to talk about Nevada's SB 427 bill, a bill that improves outdoor and indoor working conditions for Nevadans and has a huge impact on the Latino community in Nevada. And we'll hear about the fight going on there and lessons learned. We'll also talk about EPA's new carbon rules, what they are, the different nuances, and contours of the rules and ways to get involved as the public comment period opens up. And then we'll open up the space for member updates and announcements and for all of us to talk with one another and share what might be going on, opportunities for collaboration, and other calls to action. So with that, if we can move to the next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Stephen Schima, the Senior Legislative Counsel at Earthjustice, to talk about permitting reform, Earthjustice. Stephen and his team have been one of the key leaders in moving the permitting reform fight forward and building education and coalition building in this space. So we're super excited he's here to give us some updates and context about what's been going on there. So without further ado, I'll turn it over.
Thanks, Dharma. And you can go ahead and advance it actually 2 slides. So, hey, everyone. One, I just want to start by saying thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. I am a longtime admirer of Green Latinos and absolutely thrilled to get the opportunity to speak with you all today. I also want to specifically thank Dharma and Irene for all their work in putting this together. It's an absolutely timely talk that we're having today. So I'm here to talk about a phrase that's been a hot topic of discussion for over a year now, and that's permitting reform. And I know that doesn't sound terribly exciting, but bear with me for just a few minutes because it's absolutely critical. It's a critical conversation that directly impacts all the amazing work that Green Latinos is engaged in. A lot of our organizations are engaged in. And it's a conversation that is really kind of coming to a boil even today as we speak. So this is just a quick overview of what we're going to be discussing. But, before we really jump into things, and you can advance to the next slide here, the permit reform discussion. So this phrase is vague. So what is permitting reform? And at its core, it's simply the process by which projects are approved, right? But it's much more than that. And and what it is and what it exactly means depends on who you're talking to. And for a lot of Republicans, permit reform means essentially cutting out environmental and health regulations so industries can build more without oversight, without transparency, without accountability. Meanwhile, for a lot of Democrats, permit reform means speeding up the process by which we build out a clean energy economy and respond to the climate crisis. More importantly, it's about how do we speed things up? How do we build out an efficient permitting system where we can get projects built that's not only efficient, but also equitable? And for communities, it means something else entirely. But before we talk about that, I really just want to spend a minute talking about the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, because it's, essentially the core of what these conversations are revolving around. And you can jump to the next slide. So the legal framework of permitting, I'm not going to get into the weeds on this, but I want to give a little bit of background here because the National Environmental Policy Act was born in 1969 out of a series of events that were occurring over the previous few decades. And the 2 major ones was, just uptick in environmental catastrophes. There was a massive oil spill off the coast of Santa Barbara. There was the build out of the national highway system, which is particularly relevant because that's the kind of massive linear infrastructure that folks want to build out now in terms of transmission to hook up the terawatt of renewable energy that we need to respond to the climate crisis. We need to do something similar in terms of the amount of infrastructure that needs to be built out, but we need to do it, both efficiently and equitably. And I stress the equitably part because this is why NEPA came about. The law itself, the National Environmental Policy Act, unfortunately has the word environment in it because it's much more than that. And it's, it requires federal agencies to look at not only the environmental impacts, but the health impacts, the social impacts, the cultural impacts. And the reason that is because the build out of the highway system was, it essentially secured and locked in place generations of, it was premised off racism and it locked in racism for generations by dividing communities, by exploiting communities of color, low-income communities. There are still communities around the country that are still trying to recover from the build out of the highway system There were riots in Baltimore and Minneapolis, where I am now. Baltimore is where I was before, but in LA and Florida. And it's because the federal government was essentially going out there, building things and not asking community members, not talking to the frontline communities that are first impacted by infrastructure build out. And NEPA was that response. And you can jump to the next slide. And then here and I can't really see it, but I think I have a definition of the major federal action language. And basically what NEPA does is requires the federal government to look before it leaps. And I think that's a phrase a lot of people, associate with NEPA, but it's such a common sense principle that was never actually in government decision-making before that. It's so common sense that over 170 countries have adopted similar legislation, and it's the most widely imitated law the US has come up with. And the part of the reason for that, and part of the success of it, is it incorporates community voices, but it also was prescient in terms of thinking about future generations and climate change. And NEPA requires not only agencies to look at what are the impacts of a project, say like a coal plant or a petrochemical facility, what are the impacts going to be on climate, but also what are the impacts of climate on communities, on the infrastructure itself. It's about making sure that we're spending money wisely, taxpayer dollars wisely. And it does this through 3 levels of review, which I'm not going to get into the details of, but I listed them there because that is what's being talked about in the legislation that we're going to be discussing today. And right now, the White House and House Republicans are, as we speak, having conversations about what kind of permit reform to include. And all of it revolves around NEPA. And you can jump right to the next slide. And we're not going to get into the details of the legislative language itself, but I do want to flag the principles that are at stake. And these are the principles that NEPA embodies and that were codified into the law, and what is exactly what this legislation will impact. The first of the 3 principles of NEPA is transparency. It essentially requires that the government not only look at what are the impacts, the health impacts, the environmental impacts, like I said, the cultural impacts from a project, but it also forces government to disclose those impacts. And that's absolutely critical. It is a sunshine law. It is a law that allows communities to know what's happening in their neighborhood. And you can jump to the next slide. The second part or principle of NEPA is if the government's going to do a project and they don't consult the public, they don't look at the impacts, they don't disclose those impacts, there's accountability. There's a mechanism to hold the government accountable when they do ignore communities. And this is a core part of the lesson learned from the build out of the highway system and all the other environmental disasters, both previous and that we're seeing even to this day with, I don't know if folks are aware of what happened in East Palestine. There's also petrochemical fires going on in Texas right now. Like the same communities that bore the brunt of the build out of the fossil fuel infrastructure 50 years ago are still bearing that brunt. And we need to be able to hold the government accountable. The third, and you can jump to the next slide. The third is the most important, and that's public input. And this is a part of NEPA and permit reform conversation, which I know sounds bland, but which is so like core to democracy, is the public input part of this. NEPA is the broadest mechanism for public input in the federal government. And most people don't realize this, but if they're building a highway, if they're building a oil and gas pipeline, or if they're building something in your community and there's a meeting about that, that is due to NEPA. It previously wouldn't have happened. Most people don't understand that NEPA is the one opportunity that they get to be able to get involved in these kind of decisions. And that is exactly what is in the crosshairs right now, these conversations that are happening on the Hill. And you can jump to the next slide. So before we talk more about the legislation, a little bit more of a preface. So, I've been stressing NEPA, I've been stressing these environmental laws because what we want to talk about when we're having these conversations about building out a clean energy economy is to focus squarely on what is the problem we're solving for. And we always hear from the right that the problem is NEPA, the problem is the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act, and we know that's not the case. And we actually have the studies to prove that. They've been coming out for years now. There's been more in the last few years, and the results of those studies are counterintuitive. While a lot of Republicans like to blame NEPA for the problems, The truth is the major causes of delay, especially when we're talking about clean energy build out and renewable energy and transmission, the problem isn't the environmental laws or regulations. The problem is an underfunded underfunded resource agencies, underfunded government agencies that don't have the training, the resources, or the technology they need to actually do the work that they're mandated to do. But more importantly, a lot of these delays are on the project sponsor side or the industry side, where there's changes in project design, there's a failure to provide materials. But the number one problem has long been lack of funding for the agencies. And what Congress did last Congress, or what we did last year in the Inflation Reduction Act, was historic. Congress, for the first time in history, included $1 billion to address something that they know will result in speedier, more equitable decisions. And that was provide the money to the agencies to the tune of $1 billion. That money is specifically earmarked for outreach to communities and review. And the outreach to communities part is something that I think folks are kind of missing in this discussion. We have a couple of studies out in the last couple of years where it shows that the more you reach out to communities, the more you do so, the faster projects move along, the less conflict there is, and the less litigation. And you can jump to the next slide. The problem here is that what we're seeing from Republicans right now, and this is what is being discussed in the White House in these negotiations with Speaker McCarthy, is a Republican bill, and it's HR 1. And HR 1 is indicative of the priority is for House Republicans. It is their number one priority, and it is the most extreme legislation we have ever seen in this space. And it is what they are negotiating from. And that bill would do, there's too many things to go through in its entirety, but I'm flagging just a couple. The first is this. It essentially waives the application of NEPA. So no public input, no review, no government accountability, no consideration of climate change for things that don't occur on public lands. And that may sound kind of wonky, but that would sweep away offshore energy development, nuclear facilities, coal-fired plants, concentrated animal feeding operations. The list goes on, and it's astonishing and staggering just how sweeping it is. The other thing, and you can jump to the next slide, is it would essentially codify climate denial into the federal decision-making process by prohibiting agencies from looking at the long-term impacts, the cumulative effects. And when I say cumulative effects, that is where the number one area where we look at climate and health impacts. The number one environmental justice concern is cumulative effects, because it takes into account the historic legacy pollutants that communities have been exposed to that lead to things like increased rates of asthma for communities living near highways or factories. And it's also the quintessential climate impact, right? It is this small aggregate of things together that we need to be looking at. And the House Republican bill would eliminate that. And you can jump to the next slide. This is something, and colleagues, including Representative Grijalva, who's been a champ on NEPA, on permitting for the last several years, he has coined this phrase, the Polluters Over People Act. It's in sharp contrast to what Democrats put out last Congress. Their HR 1 was for the People Act, which was trying to advance democracy. This bill would go backwards because it actually limits democracy. It's about disenfranchising people from the decisions that the federal government is making. The bill itself, the Polluters Over People Act, HR 1, if any pieces of this actually get codified, it'll be a disaster. And it's hard to overstate just how bad that bill is. And you can jump to the next slide here. And just to give a little preview of what I think is on the table, is one of the provisions is allowing project sponsors or industry to actually do their own reviews, essentially give themselves self-graded exams and decide what should and should not be disclosed to the public, as well as determining how long the public will have to engage in these processes. So it's a really high stakes negotiation that's going on right now. And I want to flag something here too, which is whatever happens right now with HR 1 is on the table for lifting this debt ceiling so that we pay our bills. But this conversation isn't going away after the debt ceiling conversation. Whatever's agreed to, this is still going to be the number one priority for House Republicans. And there's still Democrats that want to see progress on, permitting renewable energy and transmission. And we know that can be done in a way that is both efficient and equitable, but it's not through gutting these types of laws. So the question is, and you can jump to the last slide here. We've talked about what's at stake in terms of, climate justice and clean air and sustainable communities and future generations. But the fact is with, these bills that are being proposed, and HR 1 is just one of several that contain similar provisions. The whole point of them is to cut people's voice out of the process. And if we don't have voices, there's no justice. And so the question becomes, what can we do? And right now, I think there are a lot of opportunities to engage. It's not too late, even with the negotiations that are going on between the White House, but those conversations, like I said, are going to be ongoing. So, elected officials outreach today, tomorrow, going forward, this is going to be an active conversation for the next few months is absolutely critical. Engaging over social media, uplifting the visibility of what's at stake is critical, but also reframing the narrative so that we're focused on the right conversations and solutions that are actually responsive to known causes of delay and build out of the climate or the clean energy economy. And, avoiding these traps of, we need to gut core environmental and health protections. So there's some tools that we'll share after this call that will be sent around and that provide, toolkits, sample letters to the editor, but all engagement at this point, it's kind of an all hands on deck moment. And I think it will be for the next few months. And I think I prattled on longer than my time was allotted. So I'm going to draw it to a close, but I'm happy to answer any questions too.
Thank you, Stephen. No, that was really great and really thorough. And I also appreciated actually the historical elements and kind of giving that framing and that, that context to set up the fight that we're in right now and the stakes that are, the high stakes that we're in too. So I just wanted to open it up to the audience. Feel free to raise your hand or, you can drop a question in the chat. But I can get us kicked off on the first question that I was just wondering, Stephen. I remember studying NEPA in law school, and it's so strange to me to see all of the attacks that are happening because we studied it as it's a bedrock law. We literally studied it like a foundational piece of legislation that is core to a lot of, legal precedent that happened after that. It was never a question in kind of administrative law that it would be challenged to this extent. And so one question that I have for you is, why specifically do you think, obviously this is a Republican tactic to take away a lot of the accountability and fast track fossil fuel projects, but why specifically? It seems like there's been specific buildup towards attacking NEPA as a central tactic over the last year and a half or couple of years. Can you signal to any specific motive behind that? Why specifically this has been a big focus over the last couple of years?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll give hopefully a very quick two-part answer. One is there's been a blueprint laid out, and this is by the Heritage Foundation a decade ago, when they laid out the blueprint to essentially repeal NEPA, and they explicitly stated in the paper, and they've done this in congressional testimony. They've said the goal is to rescind NEPA. Now, why NEPA? Because it's the umbrella statute through which all of our other environmental laws operate under. So you do Clean Water Act reviews, you do ESA reviews, you do all these reviews under the auspices of NEPA, and they know without that coordinating function that it could be the camel's nose under the tent, so to speak, of dismantling, the administrative state in the environmental sphere. And the way that they laid it out was, we know we can't repeal it head on. So they laid out the several steps that will pave the way to rescission. And what they laid out is exactly what we're seeing in legislation. And some of it's already occurred in the highway bills, where they've essentially limited public input, they've limited judicial review, they've limited consideration of alternatives. And that is exactly what Republican think tanks laid out a decade ago. And it's exactly what they're putting in place right now. And I think the reason is, one, misunderstanding, because, NEPA is not necessarily the problem, but two, I think there's this broader agenda to a kind of deregulatory fever dream where they want to see the administrative state and the environmental sphere deregulated to the point of being meaningless.
Yeah. Thank you for that answer. Laura Esquivel.
I would also say because NEPA's been successful, right? As a tool of the law, right? And so Republicans, and oil companies see this thing standing in their way. So any chance, like Stephen said, it's a long game for them. Anything to undermine NEPA is a win for them. My question, Stephen, and thank you for that. That was a lot in a very short amount of time and very comprehensive. I know you're going to be sending around talking points later, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the politics on the Democratic side, right? Because Democrats are also talking about the need for permitting reform. And so there's a danger in that as well, right? But so how do we talk about this in a way that addresses those, I don't know about concerns, but because of the hostage taking in the IRA, right, there also needs to be, there are going to be some reform proposals, right? And so what are the positive ones or the affirmative ones, if we have any, that we can say, of course, there needs to be reform and this is how you do it?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the core challenges. And I think the best way, well, one, it depends on your audience. If we're talking to, champs and like Representative Grijalva, we get to have fact-based conversation on solutions that are actually responsive to known causes of delay. For some of the other more problematic members, and I'll just, throw out a name like Senator Schatz, who really want to see a build out of a clean energy economy. The problem is they fundamentally misunderstand what the problem is. And this idea of what problem are we solving for is a good start to a conversation, because if you preface that with, we share the same goal, which is we want to build out a clean energy economy that is efficient and equitable. Nobody will disagree with that. We share that concern. We have more skin in the game than anybody. And this is where we see the solutions are. And there are those bills out there, like you mentioned, that are positive, that look at transmission build out and renewable development and say, okay, here's where the bottlenecks are. None of them involve NEPA or the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act. They are focused on things that are actually mostly focused, that it's not very sexy for Congress because they always want to legislate, but it mostly has to do with management and oversight. To the extent that you're doing things within the federal agencies, they don't have the staff or resources, and to the extent that they do, there needs to be better management, oversight, and prioritization of projects. The fact is, that's where we've seen the quick build out of, say, a transmission line is due to those factors, nothing else.
Thank you. Thank you for that question, Laura. I think that's very poignant, and it's been confusing because there's so many different proposals coming out too on both sides. So I appreciate you breaking that down. We dropped in the chat the Google Drive with some resources, and we'll share out more resources and ways to get involved. But thank you so much, Stephen. Appreciate your time. And I have the privilege now to introduce our next speaker, which is Cinthia Moore. She's a coalition coordinator for the Nevada Environmental Justice Coalition, and she's going to speak about a bill in Nevada that's gone through a little bit of a process, actually, just even last week. So Cinthia, take it away.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate the invitation to talk about as Senate Bill 427, which is the extreme weather conditions working bill for those that work in outdoor and indoor settings. Next slide. One of the things that the coalition was doing during the summertime, we wanted. Let me just give a little background on Nevada and our legislative session. In Nevada, our state's a little unique in that our legislative our legislature is only part-time. We meet every 2 years, every odd year for 120 days. And that's the only time that legislators are able to do pass any legislation unless there's a special session that's passed by that's called on by the governor. At that point, the governor's the one that he dictates what the agenda will be for that special session. The coalition has good relationships with several legislators, and we were able to find a bill sponsor for our bill. During the summer, we have a subcommittee called the Policy Committee that was meeting to try to figure out what that bill would be. After talking to different community members and based on what our member organizations were hearing on the ground, a lot of people were saying that because in Las Vegas, they work outdoors, a lot of times their employers, their supervisors will not give them an opportunity to even go drink water. They tell them, no, it's not your break time, keep working. And we found through those conversations that there's really nothing out there for employees to be protected when they work either indoors or outdoors in extreme weather conditions. The other thing is in Northern Nevada, air quality has been a big issue in our state due to the wildfires that they have in Northern Nevada, or even from they get some of the air, the smoke from Oregon, Washington, and other states during the wildfires. So that's how we came up with the idea of bringing a bill that would help protect outdoor workers, especially those that are most vulnerable. And we know that a lot of folks in our community, in the Latina community, work outdoors or even work indoors in kitchens where they're exposed to extreme heat. Nevada is home of one of two of the fastest warming cities in the country. Reno's #1, Las Vegas #2. Current law in Nevada does not define what extreme heat is or even heat-related illnesses, giving too much room for employers to create their own definitions of safety for employees, which also leaves the employees unprotected. And even if they went to OSHA, there's nothing that OSHA could do because there's nothing protecting them from this. During the interim legislative session, the Department of Business Relations and Industry, which oversees Nevada OSHA, tried to pass and adopt regulations to protect outdoor workers. A lot of the regulations have a lot to do with what we were trying to put in this bill, which is providing water for the employees, shade, also medical devices where people can monitor their heat-related symptoms. But it failed because the Legislative Commission at that time was equal amount of Republicans and equal amount of Democrats, and it failed on a party line vote. Next slide. So oppositions to the regulations were business and industry, the chambers, the different business chambers, the contractors associations, the new home builders association. They were all opposed to the regulations with OSHA. They said that they were overreaching what what they could do. And that's when the NEJC decided to bring forward the Extreme Weather Working Conditions Bill, which was sponsored by Senator Edgar Flores. And part of the reason why he was very supportive and willing to sponsor this bill is because the area that he represents is East Las Vegas, which is where the majority of Latinos in Nevada live. And also a lot of his constituents are affected. They work outdoors, so they'll also work indoors in extreme conditions. And what Senate Bill 427 proposed to do was to define what extreme heat conditions to work at, what extreme heat is. Originally, the bill had it at 95 degrees, but when we were holding stakeholder meetings, people said, oh, 95 degrees is too low. Las Vegas tends to get a lot higher. We need to go higher. So in order to meet people in the middle, we agreed to 105 degrees, hoping to move some of that opposition from opposition to neutral or even supportive. The bill also wanted companies to create a written safety program and specify trainings for its employees, full-time or part-time, to make sure that they were well informed about the hazards and effects of working under extreme temperatures and how to recover from heat illnesses. Now, this portion is what gave a lot of the business and industry folks a lot of heartburn, because they were saying that it was too broad. But the reason why it stayed broad was because every business or industry is different, and they were able with this, they would be able to draft their safety plan and training based on the needs of their specific industry. And the other thing is we felt that providing folks with a training on how to recover from heat illnesses, or how heat illnesses can affect you while working outdoors. We wanted to make sure that people knew what to look out for, especially those that are taking certain medications. They may not be aware, for example, that if they're taking high blood pressure medication, they're more likely to suffer from a heat stroke while working outdoors because of the type of medication they're taking. Next slide. So Senate Bill 427, while we were able to get a lot of support from unions, we worked closely with them and what they wanted to do. They were supportive of this, even though their members are already protected by their PLAs, their project labor agreements. They wanted to even the playing field. They wanted to make sure that other other employers were doing the right thing. And they worked with us. One of them co-presented the bill with us when it was heard in the Senate Commerce and Labor Committee. And again, a lot of the opposition was saying that it was just too broad, and that the legislature was overreaching, and that they shouldn't try to regulate these standards or try to put these protections forward. And in an attempt to compromise, the bill was amended 5 different times with 5 different amendments, but they still remained against Senate Bill 427. At one point, they said just throw it back to OSHA because we'll work with them this time to get the regulations in place. Well, we told them, okay, we will agree to do that, to send it back to OSHA. But at that point, they were just not willing to move at all, effectively killing the bill last week. The chair of Assembly Commerce, Committee of Commerce and Labor last week told me she wasn't going to give the bill a hearing on Monday when I met with her. But the coalition got together we did a tweet storm. We had a lot of members, Chispa, Make the Road, and Plan. They all hosted a phone bank, and we were able to get in a lot of calls into her office, effectively giving us a bill hearing on a bill that she had told me it was dead on Monday. She gave us a hearing that Friday. But it failed to pass because industry has a lot of power here in Nevada. They have, lobbyists out here that are here full time, and we're not in the building full time. I must say, though, on the Senate side, when it did get voted out of committee, it was voted out based on party lines. And there was one specific senator that was supportive during the hearing, and once I went to confirm her vote, she changed her vote. She flipped because she just said, oh, it's too broad. We shouldn't be legislating the common sense. So the bill's dead. But just because it's dead doesn't mean that our efforts are dead. Next slide. So next steps, Labor came to the table in support of the bill, and they are committed to working with the Nevada Environmental Justice Coalition and Senator Flores to bring this bill back next session. And as a coalition, we are also committed to holding a lot more community events to hear back from community members, especially if they're affected by this, to make sure that we're showing the legislators that this is a bill that's needed, regardless of what business and industry are saying. And just something, we never thought that something so simple as providing water to your employees would be received with so much opposition. Next slide. And I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Cynthia. Yeah, that last sentence you said is kind of encapsulates everything, is super powerful. We have a question here from Carmen Bonilla. Cynthia, would you share with us educational materials provided to workers? Would love to see them and consider providing something similar to workers in her area. So a shout out just to, if that's something that's shareable, we can certainly send it around in a follow-up email. And then from Yvonne, Cynthia, did you get anyone from the medical community on board to provide scientific data?
Yes, we did. We had, to go back to the first question, we didn't create an educational piece for the workers, but we do have data I can send over. The other one, we did have the clinicians for climate change of Nevada. They were supportive of the bill and they testified in support. They provided their perspective from the medical side and scientific aspect, and what the effects of working under extreme heat conditions would have on your body. And they all also said that at 95 degrees is when your body is, when they start reacting to the heat. So yeah, we did have some doctors and the clinicians for environmental, for climate change.
Thank you, Cynthia. And I am going to move us along. I really, really appreciate you covering this. And let's see, we have one more question. Just will Green Latinos be doing a member sign-on campaign for either of these issues, or is it more of an individual action effort? That's a really good question. I would say for this one specifically, Cynthia, we would love to amplify any efforts that your coalition is working on. So I would say as a next step, we can be kind of the convener body that brings together that for the broader coalition. If you, you have a captive audience here that's happy to support, Cynthia. So let us know how we can support. And then I would say that for the permitting, there's a lot of good things that the coalition is doing as well. And what we can do is pull out some specific ones that, like, I think right now it's kind of all hands on deck, as Stephen said, rapid, like tweeting, social media, whatever pressure you can do. If you have connections to Schumer or any of those kind of like top folks doing some lobbying. And I know there's also a target list, so we can send that around as well as a follow-up. Thank you so much. Okay, next slide, we're gonna move us along, and we do, I'm apologize because we do have kind of a packed agenda, so we're moving along a little bit quickly here. And Dharma.
Thanks, Irene. Okay, yes, thank you so much, Cynthia, for that amazing presentation, Stephen as well. And now we're going to be transitioning over to diving into the new EPA power plant standards. This is a rulemaking that Green Latinos will be engaging in really directly. And so we'll talk at the end about the different opportunities for public comment and involvement that we'll be hosting and generating throughout our membership. But these are very popular rules. I'm sure the majority of folks on the call today have heard about them, either working on them or have heard of them. And we just wanted to give an overview of what these rules are, why they matter, and also dive into some of the nuances and community concerns of the rules as well, that as Green Latinos and as members of the environmental justice community, we're navigating. And so to just dive straight into it, what are these EPA power plant standards, also known as the carbon rules? So this is a proposal that the EPA released towards the beginning of the month to set enforceable carbon pollution standard limits for new and existing coal and gas power plants. The proposal requires most coal plants to reduce their carbon pollution by 90% by 2030 and requires many gas plants to do the same by 2035. And this proposed standard will also repeal the previous administration's attempt of carbon standards that the Trump administration was moving forward with. And in the chat, super quickly, I'll drop the news, the press statement from the EPA next. Oh, actually not next slide. Sorry. So why do these matter? Roughly 60% of our nation's electricity still comes from coal and gas-fired plants. So as we are transitioning towards a just renewable economy, it's really important that the EPA phases out these the fossil fuel industry quickly and timely. Power plants are the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the US after the transportation sector, and it's the largest stationary source of pollution as well. And we know that these power plants and the fossil fuel industry at large are is a major contributor to poor air quality in Latino communities as well. We can dive into the statistics of these all day, but just quickly, 15% of Latinos in the US live within 10 miles of a coal-fired power plant. Latino children are some of the most at-risk youth population to experience asthma attacks, to die from asthma. And we know that air quality and the effects of poor air quality is a major concern in our communities. And these carbon rules can help to remediate air quality by phasing out these oil and gas power plants. Lastly, these carbon rules put us on track to meet our administration's promise to cut greenhouse gas pollution in half by 2030. Next slide, please. Here is a very quick and digestible chart of some modeling done by our partners at NRDC and Evergreen Action, projecting the rate of power sector emissions with no carbon rules, if this rule didn't exist, with moderate carbon rules, and with full stringent carbon rules that get us to where we need to go. And that yellow dotted line that goes across the chart horizontally is the Biden's promise to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in a timely manner from the power sector. So that's the goal that we're trying to hit, that yellow dotted line. And if we see here, if it was only the IRA, we would only have about 65% power sector emissions reductions from 2005 levels by 2030. If we have very limited carbon rules, it'll bring us to 70%. And if we have full carbon pollution standards, it'll bring us to 77% by 2030, and will keep us on track to reach 80% reduction from 2005 levels by the mid-2030s, early 2040s. So as we can see, these rules are absolutely critical to reaching our goals and mitigating the worst effects of the climate crisis. And in the chat, I just dropped the policy brief toolkit that NRDC and Evergreen put together, where I got this chart, and there's some other data to explore and play around with there as well. And next slide, please. I'll turn it over to Irene.
Thank you. And so how do these carbon rules work? So EPA must base its performance standard on the best system of emission reduction possible, or BSER. So you'll hear that a lot, that kind of acronym. And that is something that has to be installed directly at the individual plants. And this was legal requirement that they came out of the case West Virginia versus EPA last year, that said that the EPA doesn't have authority to regulate beyond the fence line. It has to be within the fence line directly at power plants. So that has limited the EPA authority significantly. And the BSER that the EPA has come up with based on modeling includes carbon capture, hydrogen blending, and then it leaves the option for retiring a plant as well. And this is done through states. States have, through a state implementation process, or for the usual EPA process, has the flexibility, I guess, either through retiring plants, or they also have the option of really accelerating renewable energy and meeting the goals, in addition to using that BSER, best emission technology. Next slide. And so this is just a bit of a finer point on carbon capture and hydrogen. We wanted to just point out the concerns with this technology from a lot of frontline communities, as nascent, energy intensive, and costly, and it can increase localized air pollution on site by up to 20%, because it is an industrial process that you're adding onto already industrial processes with these power plants. And in most cases, it oftentimes will require the build out of underground pipelines to transport the gas to storage facilities, and there is potential to leak into the air and into water bodies. And then a couple things that have also been concerning that have come up is the carbon sequestered can often be used and is often being used for additional petroleum extraction, therefore extending the life of fossil fuels. Hydrogen is another energy intensive process that, if blended with fossil gas, as is the case with what the EPA has come out with, can create another pathway to maintain the fossil fuel industry. So we wanted to just make sure that we were giving that color and that finer point on these rules, because it is a big component of it. Next slide. And so, oh, sorry, Dharma, go ahead.
No worries, no worries. So we know that these performance standards are based on the best emissions reduction technology, which the EPA has identified as carbon capture, hydrogen blending, or retiring a plant. And so what does that mean? Where do we stand? How do we hold the potential risks of these technologies? And where Green Latinos has landed at the moment is we are overall in support of this rulemaking. A lot of the onus goes, the rule places the onus on states to reduce emissions by 90%, and between 2035 and 2045. And they have the option to retire plants. And we honor, though, that the inclusion of these technologies have a strong potential to harm our communities, and that remains a strong concern. And as we review these standards and provide comment, we are pushing the EPA to ensure rigorous monitoring and enforcement of any emissions or leaks. We are urging them to have early, sustained, and meaningful community engagement, reduce emissions, and then more broadly, encouraging the EPA and states as they develop their implementation plans to reduce emissions from the power sector by ramping up 100% renewable energy sources like wind and solar paired with battery storage, rather than relying on potentially harmful technologies like carbon capture and hydrogen blending. And so we're going to be using the carbon rules as an opportunity to push for renewable energy implementation through the IRA and advocate for strong community protections on these technologies that ultimately the EPA does have to regulate and will be regulating in this rulemaking. The Green Latinos will be involved in a public comment campaign for this rule, where we'll be fleshing out this position and fleshing out community guardrails for carbon capture, emphasizing renewable energy generation as well. And we would love to generate interest in joining us in promoting and sharing our public comments. So if you're interested in providing testimony, sharing your stories, and getting involved, please reach out in the chat or let us know via email. We're currently building out our comment collection campaign. The rule was just published in the Federal Register today. And so in the next couple weeks, we should be up and running in a campaign to make sure our voice is heard on this rulemaking. And I'll pause there and see if folks have any questions. Please drop them in the chat. I want to honor that we have 5 minutes left and we have one more presenter to speak on another rulemaking. So please drop your questions and comments in the chat for carbon rules, and Eden and I will answer those. And right now I'll pass it over to Daria. Next slide, please, to talk about the EPA's proposed rule on ethylene oxide. Is Daria still on, or did they have to?
Oh yeah, sorry, I was just talking on mute. I'm so sorry.
Perfect. No worries.
I'm gonna really quickly just put in the chat Google Doc that has all of the resources that I'm mentioning today, just to make it easy so you guys get access to that, as well as my email in case there are questions, because I know I'm working with limited time here. So I'm Daria Minovi. I am a senior analyst at the Union of Concerned Scientists in our Center for Science and Democracy. If you go to the next slide, I know this is a horrible slide, but I'll just try to give you a quick summary of this issue and rulemaking. So some of you folks might have heard of ethylene oxide before. It is regulated as a hazardous air pollutant under the Clean Air Act. So we have what you've probably heard of NESHAPs, National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants. They're updated periodically by EPA. Ethylene oxide is a gas. It's used in a variety of processes, chemical processes, to manufacture other chemicals and plastics, but it's also used to sterilize medical equipment. About half of all medical devices, sterile medical devices in the US are sterilized with ethylene oxide. It's also used to sterilize some spices. It's regulated under like 6 or 7 source categories. So these are like types of facilities that are using ethylene oxide for all these processes I just mentioned. And it is a carcinogen. In 2016, EPA's IRIS program completed a risk assessment that determined that exposure to ethylene oxide can increase your risk of certain types of cancer. We released a report, which is linked somewhere in that Google Doc that I shared, that mapped where these facilities are located, and also looked at the demographic information about the facilities that are impacted. And we found that predominantly communities of color, low-income communities, and Spanish-speaking communities are predominantly located near these sterilization facilities. I was just talking about these facilities are using it for medical sterilization. Sorry, was someone speaking? Oh, sorry about that. We have an interactive map that we've developed if anyone wants to look up these facilities. Also, the map is available in Spanish and in English, and we have a ton of Spanish language resources accompanying this report as well, including a fact sheet for anyone who's interested. There were an alarming number of these facilities, particularly higher risk facilities, which are in blue on the map in Puerto Rico, and then also just a scary number as well, particularly in US-Mexico border communities that have a high proportion of Latina communities. So we have been working on this analysis in tandem with what's happening now, is that EPA is finally almost a decade late updating regulations for these facilities. It's been almost a decade. The good folks at Earthjustice sued EPA for failing to do so as they're required to. And right now, regulations for sterilizers do not account for cancer risks and are not accounting for the disproportionate exposure of people to these facilities. If you want more information, I'd look up the communities in Laredo, Texas, and Memphis, Tennessee, and in Atlanta, Georgia, who've been doing a lot of advocacy around this. But comments on this rulemaking are due June 12th. And in the Google Doc I shared, there is a comment guide that gives you all of the breakdown of what's in the rule and what we and primarily our community partners have been recommending, because this is a huge issue, and ethylene oxide is extremely toxic. It's more toxic than benzene. And there have been recorded cases of cancer around these facilities. So I know that was super fast. And if you have any questions or you're like, what did she just say? Feel free to send me an email and definitely check out the Google Doc with resources. But if folks are planning to submit a comment or would like to learn more, I'm happy to chat with them. Thank you, Paula, for sending that as well.
Thanks, Daria. Yeah, we packed a lot in today's agenda, so we won't have time for Q&A, but what we can do is, send around this fact sheet, and our follow-up email will kind of contain more on all of these speakers and follow-up pieces. So I just asked for the speakers on here, please email me and Dharma if like there are specific things you'd like us to uplift. And then, and then if there are any additional member updates too, just email me and Dharma, because we're not going to have time to do that as usual. We usually go around and do some member updates. But the last thing we just wanted to shout out, and I know we're at time, next slide, please, is just to wanted to advocate, I guess, and uplift our national summit in San Antonio that's happening June 5th through the 8th. And it's right around the corner. There's still an opportunity to sign up. And we're always looking for sponsors too. So the sponsorships go towards scholarships so that people can afford to go, and we can use those and get as many people as possible over there. But it should be a great time. We will also kind of in our follow-up send out like a kind of a bare bones agenda that we have with our breakouts. And it's going to be a great opportunity to connect, to co-learn, co-lead, and just kind of, have a good time in person after many years being completely virtual. So I appreciate so much everyone's time. And next time, maybe we can do, add like a little extra like hour and 15 or something for our really packed agenda. So thank you so much. And just email me and Dharma with anything else.